are. Welcome to International Women's Day. This is Honest Conversations with the Purple Goddess, and I'm Purple Goddess, and I am delighted to welcome my guest, Dr. Emma Lind. And let me say straight off the bat that I've known Emma since she was 8 years old when I became her stepmom, and I have watched in total amazement her journey, and here we are today, two adult women talking about International Women's Day. And Emma, you teach women and gender studies at Okanagan College in British Columbia. And you're connected to a wonderful organization in Toronto by the name of Anima, where you're the director of training and development. And Anima does amazing anti-racist work. So welcome to this time.
Thank you very much. It's fun to be here.
Great, it's great to see you. And what I thought we could do with our time today with International Women's Day is to talk about the different waves of feminism. And even saying that word for my generation was a big stretch, not so much anymore, but there are 4 waves of feminism. But before we kind of launch into that, I wanted to say I did a little research about March 8th. And one of the things I learned is that March 8th, around 1917, was a day when women in Russia got the suffrage. And here we are on March 8th, 2022, with some very interesting dynamics with the country of Russia invading Ukraine. I wondered if you had any comment about that.
Oh, well, it's interesting when we talk about the history of feminism. Often the story starts around activism to get the right to vote. And certainly in North America and in many parts of the globe, fighting for the right to vote went hand in hand with the war effort. Women proved themselves as citizens by assisting in the war effort. And that's certainly the story in Canada, where women were first given a provisional right to vote in order to vote on behalf of their husbands who were at war. And then that became the precedent that women organized for an expanded franchise. So, I mean, we're right. So it's interesting, we're celebrating and honoring an important moment in Russian history as we again see militarism being a dominant expression of patriarchal society. And I think that's what was one of the sparks that made me interested in studying feminism. Was I had never thought of war as an issue related to feminism. I hadn't thought of it as gendered until I started studying it that way.
Yes, and how ironic and sad that here we are, all these many years later, having to worry about the might of militarism. And all the gendered roles. I mean, all the pictures we're seeing these days of men kissing their children as wives and children take trains and flights out of Ukraine, and men stay back to fight. These gender roles are deeply embedded in a militaristic way of thinking. Yes, yeah. Well, listen, let's jump into the first wave of feminism. And one of the things I want to say, Emma, is just how much I've learned from you over the years. And I'll get to one of the things that I learned in a few moments. But the first wave was sort of, let me just do a sidebar here and say I'm fascinated with everybody's interest in shows like Downton Abbey and where we're kind of glued to these series where we watch women that have no power, and their lives are dictated by their relationship to class and to men in particular. And you were either Miss, meaning your status was single, or you were Mrs. There was no kind of in between or judgment, and it was in between. What are your thoughts about way back then, 19th century, the beginnings of kind of feminism?
I'm obsessed with the Gilded Age right now. I'm obsessed with the show. I can't stop watching it. And it's really interesting to me that one of the stars from Sex and the City is in the Gilded Age.
Yes.
And there's this kind of hidden commentary because both Sex and the City and the Gilded Age are stories about women in New York. And so when I think about, I'm just going back to a book I read, which really shifted things for me a few years ago, called All the Single Ladies, by Rebecca Traister, who's a fabulous journalist. And one of the things she talked about was how urban spaces create an environment where women are able to reach beyond more traditional gender roles, because so much of the labor associated with women, cooking, laundry, house cleaning, can be outsourced in urban spaces, like with a laundromat down the block or a takeout place down the block. And so when I think about the first wave of feminism and some of the social changes that informed all the activism around fighting for the right to vote, what was happening was urban spaces were growing and new ways of social relating were on the table. And it was one of the things we forget about when we talk about women's right to vote, is the fact that voting was relatively new as a thing for everybody to do. So when I teach gender studies, I talk about the first folks who had the right to vote in Canada, which were old, white men who owned property. That was a very small elite of folks. And slowly, their wives were allowed to vote. And then poor men who didn't own property could vote, who were white. And then slowly men of color could vote, and then women of color could vote. And so this whole idea of voting has always been premised upon a very small elite group of folks. And it's always been related to who owns property, and who is ruling the culture. So when I look at shows like The Gilded Age and Downton Abbey, what's fascinating to me is how the story is so much more complicated than what the history books tell us, because we could almost think that women weren't doing anything before they could vote. But when you watch those shows, you see all the different ways they were participating in society, creating the Red Cross and, setting up, social work came around that time, right? Like setting up institutions and talking about poverty being a problem and homelessness being a problem. So it's humbling to remember that a lot of that work was done before the franchise had expanded.
And the whole story about the beginnings of the Red Cross, that's so fascinating, from the Gilded Age. And now here we are, the Red Cross being just a huge humanitarian effort. I think a lot of these organizations probably had roots in women saying, something's wrong somewhere. Let's do something about it.
Right? Yeah, and there was a whole, I'm obsessed with the Gilded Age right now. I'm watching every episode. I'm loving it. Yeah. What's really happening, the women's right to vote was part of a cultural shift where social power shifted from what family you were born into to how you earned your wealth. And so that's what's playing out in the Gilded Age. And so all the people who started the Red Cross and settlement houses and public schools and the establishment of hospitals, that was a new group, that was a new class of folks who were earning money and were becoming wealthy within their lifetimes, whereas previously the only way you got money was by marrying into it or inheriting it. And so that new money was considered not as important. And so to make their mark on society, they started creating a public culture that ultimately led to everybody participating, which is the further democratization.
One of the things I learned from you was about don't want to say the word monument, but our country is got all these monuments, dedicated to, men and horses and all the wars that were fought. And I remember you saying at some point, oh my gosh, there's these beautiful statues in Ottawa. Was it it's the group of five?
The famous five.
Famous
Well,
five.
that I learned that because I was a tour guide on Parliament Hill.
Yes.
And we would go to all the statues of all the fathers of Confederation. And there would be these men on these podiums. You'd always be looking up at them. And then they would have these women, mythical figures at the bottom, almost like the Statue of Liberty. They'd have women in kind of nightgowns at the foot of the Johnny MacDonald. And this figure would be holding a tablet that would say like liberty or justice or something. So I thought, like, women are getting represented as ideas, but the men get to be people. And then there's this one statue on Parliament Hill that represented Canadian history, which was the famous five statue. And the figures were larger than people, but you could walk right up to them. You could sit on their laps and you could have a tea party with them. And I thought that was a brilliant way of telling the story of the famous five.
Yes.
That it was a statue you could participate in, and the idea of voting was a way of making democracy something you could participate in.
Yes, Nellie McClung being one of the Canadians, and I think Agnes McPhail. These women are now, hopefully children are studying the history of these women in Canada. Having this conversation in a Canadian context. Moving on to the second wave of feminism, which is those of us who are baby boomers really kind of relate to that, the 60s and the 70s, where, you know, previously our mothers were used or needed in the war effort, and then all of a sudden the war's over and women are relegated into the home. And one of the big books of that era was Betty Friedan's book, Mystique, you know, like, what is this? I'm in suburbia, I'm not happy, this is a problem that has no name. It was a groundbreaking book that you know, had its own liberation. So there was a huge kind of liberation movement in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and it was also a reflection of the intensity of that time. It wasn't until I watched a show on CBC about what it meant to run a house in the 50s that I realized it was a time of economic prosperity on a large scale for middle-class families in Canada. So there were new stoves and bigger houses, and all that prosperity meant that the woman was associated with keeping a really clean home, and she had to just clean it constantly. And everything had to be in perfect order. So that push to over-identify with how clean your house is, I can't imagine living then. Like, I feel like my brain would begin to rot if my whole identity had to be based on how clean my house was.
And it was also having a certain kind of home, right? Better Homes and Gardens.
Right.
Good Housekeeping was the magazine.
Yeah, Good Housekeeping. And then, and the idea that you had to really pretend it was happy.
Yes.
That you weren't allowed to say, I want more than this.
Yes. And so I think one of the things that happened was what's called the CR groups, or consciousness raising groups, where women got together in small circles and starting to talk about their angst with their life. And this is where the phrase, the personal is political, kind of got born. What was personal to one woman was, oh my gosh, it was personal to her neighbor, but it was political because it was an issue that needed political attention, like birth control, like date rape, like domestic violence. Women were able to speak the truth about their life, and somebody else would say, oh my gosh, well, that's me too. And this kind of led to fighting back what you were describing, this discontent about being at home and pretending everything was perfect. And I think the second wave of feminism saw a lot of organizations come to the forefront, you know, Planned Parenthood and date rape centers and shelters for battered women. Like, there was a lot of hard work that women did when they came out of the closet, so to speak, of I'm an unhappy person just being at home.
Well, and those were institutions that had never existed before.
No, right.
So like when I went to university, every time I went to a student center, there was a fishbowl on the counter filled with condoms.
Yeah.
It's really commonplace for there to be, it's easy to access samples of birth control pills that you can get for free as you figure out what kind of birth control you want to use. And the conversation is publicly had and pretty matter of fact. The idea that there was a silence around those issues in the 50s and 60s
Yes.
is foreign to me. And I feel so lucky that it's foreign, because I can't imagine what that would have been like.
Yes, birth control wasn't available.
Abortion wasn't available. I mean, it wasn't
available.
So all these, but there were all these networks of women creating shelters to deal with domestic violence, and creating networks of abortion providers and networks of information where you could access services. And I think that the second wave really made public all those private conversations, which allowed people to really dream bigger for themselves and be honest. And it was also at that time, and I remember Dad taught me this, he said, it was at that time with all this feminist activism happening that men were burning draft cards.
Yes.
So men were also saying, we don't like these gender roles. And the civil rights movement was really active and flourishing, and, you know, gay liberation. So there are all these moments of social change that kind of came together. And I think gender on all those issues became remade in the second wave.
Yes, yes, it was the beginning of a lot of social activism that's still playing itself out. But one of the things that stands out for me too is the Ms. magazine, the first issue. We, you know, I remember, you know, we went and bought it and they held it up, and it was like all of a sudden you could have an identity as a woman without being Miss somebody, meaning you were unmarried or you were Mrs. somebody. All of a sudden, Ms. And Ms. is still in existence as a magazine, kind of telling political stories, and it's sad that we still have to tell political stories. Well, let's kind of jump a little bit into, well, just to go back a little bit to the second wave, I don't want to forget, you know, women couldn't get a mortgage on their own, you know, and or all kinds of things, credit card on your own. It was a huge, I think the second wave was a huge breakthrough. And it was also a breakthrough, as you say, with class. It wasn't just the wealthy women of the Gilded Age that were able to begin to affect social change. Women began to really work together, march together, talk together, dream together, and make change.
The class thing is really significant, because when there's a story that gets told sometimes of the second wave being a time when women entered the workforce in large numbers. But of course, working class women had always been in the workforce. It was the first time that middle class women wanted and were able to push to achieve jobs like their husbands had. There are some terrible stories women your age tell me, where they say things like, I was taught if you wanted to be a lawyer, marry a lawyer. If you want to be a doctor, marry a doctor. Like, talk about riding back seat, you know?
Yeah, and a lot of women did that, you know? They supported their husband's career when they were the one that was really equally as smart, if not smarter. And nowadays, it's just so wonderful to see women as doctors, and it's become much more normal that you would have a woman doctor, woman dentist. I remember the first time I was on an airplane and the pilot was female. I was like, "Yay! It's a female pilot, really?"
Right. But it must have. If your title, like if your name was literally Mrs. John Smith, like you lost your name.
Yes.
You couldn't even have your own money. You didn't have a certain public role unless you were married. And then if you had any ambition, you should find a husband who has that. Like, to me, I can almost feel it in my throat, such silencing.
Yes.
It must have been very stressful to live through.
And then women were up against, you know, a psychiatric system that said, you're depressed and here's some medication, rather than understanding the political ramifications of depression for a lot of women, which was being silenced and just not, having their own creative life. And we've come a long way since that, hopefully. Well, let's dive into the third wave of feminism, which is sort of, I don't know how to describe it, kind of more progress on reproductive rights.
Yeah, I mean, it was third, I think, unlike second wave feminists grew up with the right to vote, for many of them. But third wave feminists grew up, as I did, with condoms in student services offices and women doctors, and an expectation that we could chart our own course. There was still a lot to do. I think that within the third wave, I was 13 when Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas. So the culture was still denying sexual harassment happened. But there was an emerging language for how to deal with it. And there was a lot of anti-war activism. I think issues of sexuality were really important to the third wave. Gay marriage was not legalized. And certainly within my lifetime, I have seen the language of gender and sexuality expand on a mainstream level. I remember not even having the language of cisgender when I was 20.
Right. Yeah.
And now I think 20-year-olds are very clear about cisgender and trans identities and non-binary identities, and the fact that there's a diversity. Whereas when I was coming of age, you were like gay, straight, or bi.
Yeah.
And you were like unidentified or trans, but there was no. Right now, I think there's a much greater awareness of the gray area between all those identities.
Yes, and for sure, let's come back to that. And I also just want to mention the book, The Vagina Monologues, which kind of came along in the third wave, where we were finally able to say the word vagina, and that the monologues kind of went around the world as women were able to, read that book on stage and give a voice to their body, their yonis, what I wanted to say. Kind of the beginning to embrace and be embodied as women was that made a huge impact for many people.
And it was like international feminist art.
Yes.
Like there were vagina monologues on college campuses and in community centers, and for years it was it was very democratic. You could, as a community organization, you could stage the vagina monologues and put local nuance into it. So that was also very cool. That's a sign that the culture has a language for feminism when a public art project like that can take off.
Yes, exactly. Well, let's kind of dive into that. Some people would say, is there a fourth wave of feminism? I think probably there is. And
yeah. So, I mean, if we're going to keep the metaphor, and of course there's debates, but I'm in a weird position where I'm finding myself no longer the youngest generation of feminists, right? As I'm aging through the life cycle. So many are pointing to, the Obama era, the organizing around anti-war activism, and Donald Trump as another surge of feminist activism. And certainly in the last 10 years, I would say that trans awareness, trans identity, and trans liberation has moved from the margins closer to the center. I don't remember any trans representation on TV when I was growing up. Yeah.
Well, it's huge advancement, and I think it's going to continue, and it's probably going to shift our understanding of gender altogether, right? Yeah. From these strict understandings of what it means to be male and what it means to be female. So you're the mom of a daughter, Emma. What kind of world do you hope that she's going to kind of move into?
Well, she's moving into a world in crisis, as far as the climate crisis goes. And so I think that what it means to be a good citizen for her will be, I hope that her generation and mine will rethink citizenship and ensure that no one's illegal, and that our borders can be used to draw alliances between folks who need help, right? And it's my hope that she will have lots of choices in the kinds of relationships she wants. I had her as a solo parent in my late 30s. And I think often of my mom's mom, who had 2 kids before she was 23 and was divorced by 30. And so I'm a solo parent, and my Nana was a solo parent, but she called it her story of woe, that she felt like a victim because she had to work rather than raise kids exclusively. And she felt sorry for herself, and I don't feel sorry for myself.
Mhm.
So I hope that Sophia will be able to have a strong sense of self and be liberated by the choices rather than victimized by the limited number of choices there are,
Yeah.
And that her identity isn't attached to some man.
Right.
Like she doesn't have a man's last name, and she doesn't have to have a man in order to have money, and
So we've come a long way
yeah,
from the first wave of feminism, where you were very attached to, male last name and so on.
yeah,
Yeah. And Emma, there's still a whole lot of issues that women are going to have to face in the coming years. Still wage parity issues and daycare, access to daycare.
yeah.
Some women in the world not having a voice, not being free, still having to deal with domestic violence and so on. So, we're not leaving International Women's Day from the strong angle probably anytime soon, but here's to all the amazing women that got us to this place.
Yeah.
We celebrate them today and honor the guts.
Oh yeah, standing on the shoulders of giants.
Oh wow, yeah, it is really amazing. And we also don't want to forget that I think one of the hard things about the 60s and 70s was that the personal was political. We got that message, but we forgot it was also spiritual.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I have some hope around the divine feminine kind of coming into the culture and understanding the sacred feminine and wisdom, and that's going to be a nice balance going forward. I mean, I wouldn't be the purple goddess if I didn't believe in
That's
it.
right. That's right. Yeah. And I hope that for our boys too, that
Yes.
they'll be able to engage in their own understanding of the sacred feminine as a practice, but also within themselves.
Yes, exactly. My guest today has been Dr. Emma Lind, who teaches women and gender studies and works for a wonderful organization that does anti-racism work and so much more. Emma, there's a great quote that I think we should finish our little interview with. It comes from a famous Canadian by the name of
Nellie McClung.
Are you ready?
Yes. I'm hoping I remember it.
Let's see.
Never apologize. Never retract.
Never
explain.
Never explain. Let's start again.
Okay. Never apologize. Never retract. Never explain. Get the thing done. And let them howl.
Emma, thank you for being my guest.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Happy International Women's Day.
Happy International Women's Day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.